Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we are on our way to Hawaii. There's a moment that I remember when I traveled to the Big Island, Kona, when the pilot announced that we had crossed the point of no return. There's enough fuel to reach the islands, but not enough to turn around and make it back to the mainland. Sure, it's meant to be information, right? But something about it felt like a confession, because somewhere below, the Pacific Ocean stretches in every direction. Older than maps, older than borders, older than every ship that has ever disappeared beneath its surface. For thousands of years, people have crossed these waters carrying families, stories, songs, hopes, and griefs. Tonight, we're not chasing ghosts. We're listening to an ocean that has witnessed all of them. Now, the first thing that disappears is not the mainland. It's certainty. For hours, the view outside is almost aggressively simple. Blue sky above, blue water below. No roads, no mountains, no tiny towns clinging to the shoreline. Just an endless sheet of deep Pacific blue, stretching farther than your mind is willing to even imagine. Eventually, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've now crossed the point of no return." Apparently, this was a joke. The plane carried enough fuel to reach the Big Island of Hawaii, but not enough to turn around and make it back to California. A perfectly ordinary piece of aviation trivia. And yet, it lodged itself somewhere in the back of my mind. I've thought about that announcement for nearly 20 years. Maybe because modern life is built on exit points. Think about it. If we don't like our job, we update a resume. If we don't like our apartment, we move. Traffic gets bad, we ask our phones for another route. Everything has an escape hatch. Until suddenly, it doesn't. For several hours, suspended somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, every person on that airplane quietly surrendered the illusion that turning around was still an option. There was only one direction left. Forward. I found myself staring out the window, trying to understand just the sheer scale of what was beneath us. See, the Pacific Ocean isn't just large, it's difficult for our brains to fully comprehend, to fully process. Somewhere below us were trenches deeper than mountains are tall. Currents that travel thousands of miles without stopping, and ecosystems that existed long before anyone decided to draw borders on maps. The ocean doesn't care where California ends. And you want to know what? It doesn't care where the islands of Hawaii begin. It just carries on. I've heard people describe the ocean as peaceful, but I've never completely agreed with that. Beautiful? Without question. Hypnotic? Absolutely. Spiritual? More than almost anywhere I've ever been. But peaceful? I don't know. Peace feels temporary. The ocean doesn't feel temporary. And to declare something like an ocean is peaceful, it's completely dismissing what it's capable of. The power of storms, the aggressiveness. Some might even describe the ocean to be angry or mean sometimes. I don't think it's peaceful. It feels immense. It feels alive. And the longer I sat and looking out that tiny airplane window, the more another word started coming to mind. Patient. The Pacific Ocean feels patient to me. Patient enough to carve cliffs one wave at a time. Patient enough to wait centuries for a volcanic island to rise from the sea. Patient enough to watch civilizations discover it, name it, fight over it, and redraw maps while the tide keeps arriving exactly on schedule. There's something profoundly humbling about realizing that nature doesn't need our participation as human beings. The waves don't crash because we're watching. The sun doesn't set because we're holding our cameras. The island exists perfectly well without us. Maybe that's why arriving in Hawaii feels so different. Most vacations are built around entertainment. Hawaii feels indifferent to any kind of itinerary. It invites you to slow down, whether you plan to or not. I still remember opening the doors to the hotel room in Kona. The first thing I noticed wasn't what I saw, it was what I heard. Waves. Constantly. Not loud enough to interrupt conversation, it was just present, like breathing. The room itself was so open to the outside that there was never really silence. Day became evening, evening became night. Stars slowly appeared over the Pacific. The waves never stopped. I don't remember watching television on that trip. I don't remember checking the time very often. I remember standing on the balcony listening to water that had been moving across the planet for longer than my country has existed. What a strange perspective to carry. It makes everyday problems feel wonderfully small. When we checked into the hotel, we spoke with the concierge. He was a friendly guy, probably in his late 50s or early 60s. We talked for a few minutes before he casually mentioned that he had originally visited Hawaii on vacation roughly 20 years earlier. He loved it so much there that he canceled his flight home. That was the entire story. No dramatic music, no elaborate explanation, just, I never left. At the time, I thought it sounded adventurous. Now I think it sounds completely insane, but still ridiculously admirable. Imagine someone somewhere with no long-term plan, no guaranteed job, no apartment, no certainty that any of it will work out, and somehow still building an entire life from one impulsive decision. The older that I get, the more fascinated I become by people who trust themselves that much. And I admire them for it. Maybe intuition deserves more credit than we give. Maybe every meaningful decision feels irrational until enough time passes to call it destiny. But Hawaii also changed another thought I've carried with me. Respecting a place is different than consuming it. That's an uncomfortable concept to sit with, especially for people arriving on vacation, myself included, because paradise is often packaged as something to be purchased. Resorts, luau's, oceanfront suites, private beaches, luxury experiences. We're going to talk more about that as we carry on here on the Midnight Drive. Now, it's important to keep in mind that there's nothing inherently wrong with enjoying beautiful places. So you can rest assured, exhale. There's nothing inherently wrong with enjoying beautiful places, right? But somewhere beneath the postcards and advertisements is an older Hawaii that existed long before tourism became its primary identity. A Hawaii with languages, traditions, sacred places, stories, and beliefs that were already deeply rooted before outsiders arrived, convinced that they knew what the islands needed. Missionaries, governments, businesses, settlers. Each brought certainty with them. And certainty has a remarkable habit of mistaking itself for virtue. Entire traditions were pushed aside in the process, while the islands themselves simply continued being islands. Maybe that's another lesson the Pacific Ocean quietly teaches us. People arrive, people leave. Flags change, governments change. Hotels appear, hotels disappear. Generations come and go. The tide keeps coming in anyways. And standing there, with salt in the air, flowers somewhere nearby, and waves refusing to acknowledge my personal existence, I realize something I still haven't been able to shake. The ocean isn't peaceful. It's patient. And maybe there's wisdom in the difference. Now, there are also moments when the Pacific Ocean feels impossibly empty. And then there are moments when you realize that emptiness only exists because you haven't learned how to read it. Long before satellites, before compasses became commonplace, before maps could fit in our pockets, people crossed thousands of miles of open ocean and somehow arrived exactly where they intended. It's amazing, isn't it? Imagine standing in a canoe with nothing but stars, wind, currents, birds, clouds, and memory. No engine, no GPS, no radio. Just generations of accumulated observation passed from one person to the next. We've somehow convinced ourselves that ancient people survived because they were lucky. I don't believe that for a second. Luck does not carry entire families across the largest ocean on Earth. Knowledge does. Respect does. And patience certainly does. I've always loved the idea that somehow someone could look at the movement of waves and know land existed hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. Or notice a particular species of bird returning home at sunset and understand that an island must be nearby. That's not magic. It's paying attention. Maybe that's one of the first things modern life quietly steals from us. Attention. We spend so much time looking at little glowing rectangles that we've almost forgotten the world has been speaking to us the entire time. The Pacific Ocean never stopped communicating. We, as a species, just stopped listening. When I visited Hawaii, I found myself doing something I almost never do at home. Absolutely nothing. I'd sit on the balcony and watch the waves arrive, one after another. Exactly the same, completely different. Isn't that a beautiful thing to consider? The waves of the ocean being exactly the same, but completely different. It's part of what I was talking about with the ocean being patient. I like the word patient because you can be angry and you can be patient. You can feel peace and still be patient. You can have a whole array of emotions happening inside of you and still be patient. Exactly the same, completely different. There was no destination, no schedule, no productivity, just movement. It occurred to me that the ocean has absolutely zero interest in impressing anyone. It doesn't need likes. It doesn't need to be photographed. It doesn't care whether anybody is watching. It simply continues being itself. And that is so oddly comforting to me. Especially when I've spent most of my adult life trying to optimize every waking hour. Maybe that's another reason islands feel transformative. You don't leave because you've seen something. You leave because you've remembered something. The human beings weren't designed to sprint every second of every day. We were designed to notice, to observe weather, to listen, to wait. Of course, the Pacific doesn't only sustain life, it also demands respect. Every year, people underestimate currents that look gentle from the shore. Every year, experienced swimmers disappear. Every year, boats fail to return. The ocean itself isn't malicious, it simply refuses to negotiate. That's a distinction I think we often forget. Nature is not punishing us. Nature is simply existing at a scale that doesn't require our permission. There's nothing about that should be surprising. And there's also something strangely spiritual about that realization. Not because it proves anything, but because it shrinks the ego. Standing beside the Pacific, it's very difficult to maintain the illusion that humanity is the center of everything. The waves have been arriving for thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. And you want to know what? They'll continue long after every resort eventually closes and every photograph we've ever taken has been forgotten. And I find that very comforting. Maybe because permanence has never been humanity's strength. Stories are. People crossed these waters carrying stories. Families carried songs. Navigators carried names of stars. Parents carried children. Grief crossed the ocean. Hope crossed the ocean. Entire cultures survived because memory traveled farther than stone ever could. That's one reason I hesitate to call the Pacific Ocean haunted. Haunted almost suggests something unfinished, something trapped. The Pacific Ocean doesn't feel trapped. it feels like it's remembering. Now, in one of our very early episodes, we talked about a concept called stone tape theory. If stone tape theory proposes that places might somehow retain emotional residue, then the largest ocean on Earth has spent thousands of years collecting arrivals, departures, celebrations, shipwrecks, reunions, storms, prayers, discoveries, and last goodbyes. Not because the ocean possesses intention, but because that's simply what happens when something exists long enough. Maybe places become meaningful the same way that people do, by carrying stories. I think that's why beaches feel different after sunset. Think about it. The tourists go back to their hotels, the music fades, the restaurants start closing. What's left is wind, stars, waves, and distance. Have you ever thought about distance as an emotion? Because distance is a strange emotion. You can't hold it, nor can you measure it with your hands, but you can absolutely feel it. Standing on the western shore of Hawaii at night, looking toward nothing but open Pacific, you're staring across thousands of miles before another continent interrupts the horizon. Your mind isn't capable of processing that. So it does something else instead. It becomes quiet. Not because there are no thoughts, but because some places are simply larger than language. And maybe that's why people keep returning to Hawaii. Not because paradise is perfect. Paradise isn't perfect. Volcanoes remind us of that. Storms remind us of that. History certainly reminds us of that. People return because for a little while they're allowed to exist beside something immeasurably older than themselves. Something that isn't trying to sell them anything. Something that isn't asking them to perform. Something that simply keeps arriving at the shore over and over again. With the same steady rhythm it is always known. The Pacific Ocean gives, and the Pacific Ocean takes, and the Pacific Ocean remembers. And whether we believe that literally or just metaphorically, I'm not entirely convinced that it matters. See, there's two different versions of the Pacific Ocean. The one that we photograph and the one we imagine after dark. During the day, the ocean feels familiar. Families build sandcastles. Surfers wait patiently beyond the break. Children chase waves that somehow never get old. Everything is bright. Everything feels knowable. Then the sun disappears. And something changes. Not the ocean. Us. The same water that looked inviting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon suddenly becomes impossible to measure. The horizon vanishes. The line between sea and sky quietly dissolves until you're left staring into something that feels less like water and more like infinity. I remember standing on the beach one night, long after most people had gone back inside. I had a small ukulele, just a souvenir one. I tuned it up and I was just strumming some chords. The stars slowly emerged one by one. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Eventually there were so many that it became difficult to tell where the sky ended and the Pacific began. There wasn't anything frightening about it. It was beautiful. But beauty and unease are not opposites. Sometimes they're neighbors. I found myself listening more than looking. I stopped strumming the ukulele and I set it down. And I just listened. Every wave sounded familiar. Every wave was somehow completely different. There's a strange comfort in repetition, in rhythm. The ocean doesn't improvise very much. It simply continues. Waves crash, then they pull away. Waves crash, then they pull away. It's like the planet itself is breathing. Maybe that's why so many people find themselves thinking about people that they've lost while sitting beside the water. Because grief has rhythm too. It arrives, it recedes. It returns again when you least expect it. Never exactly the same, never completely gone. Waves of grief. I've often wondered if that's why ghost stories so frequently begin near coastlines. Not because oceans create ghosts, because oceans create reflection. If you give a person enough darkness, enough stars, enough distance, and enough waves, and eventually they'll begin talking to memories. The Pacific Ocean has probably listened to more conversations with absent people than anywhere else on Earth. Sailors saying goodbye. Families waiting for ships that never returned. Parents watching children disappear beyond the horizon toward uncertain futures. Immigrants leaving everything familiar behind. Travelers wondering if they'll ever make it back. Hope and heartbreak have crossed these waters together for thousands of years. That's enough emotional weight to make any place feel sacred. There are stories from nearly every culture surrounding the Pacific about strange lights over the water, about phantom canoes, about voices carried by the wind, about ships disappearing where no ships should be. I'm not here to convince you that those stories are literally true. Honestly, I don't know. And I think there's freedom in admitting that. Because a story survives whether we solve it or not. Maybe the light was a trick of the atmosphere. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe bioluminescence dancing across the surface. Or maybe people standing in profound darkness simply become more aware of mysteries that daylight politely hides. I'm comfortable leaving that question unanswered. The older I get, the less interested I become in certainty. Wonder seems far more rewarding to me. Stone tape theory asks whether places might somehow retain emotional residue. Whether events leave impressions that sensitive people occasionally experience. I have no idea if that's possible. But I do know this. I've walked into old churches where everyone instinctively whispers. I've stood beside abandoned theaters and then went inside and somehow felt the energy was still very expectant. I've driven empty highways at midnight that seemed to carry conversations long after the cars were gone. Places change us. Whether they remember us in return, I couldn't tell you. But if any place on Earth has accumulated enough arrivals, departures, reunions, celebrations, storms, rescues, shipwrecks, discoveries, prayers, and final goodbyes to feel emotionally immense, it's probably the Pacific Ocean. Sometimes I wonder if that's why silence feels different in Hawaii. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. So let's talk about the silence of Hawaii. It does feel different, and it's not actually silent. Think about it. There are insects, birds, wind through palm trees, distant waves, leaves moving against one another. Yet somehow, all of those sounds combine into something that feels larger than noise. It's not empty by any stretch of the imagination. It is fully present. Like sitting beside an old friend who doesn't feel obligated to fill every moment with conversation. That's another thing that modern life has almost forgotten. Silence doesn't need fixing, neither does uncertainty. Some questions are beautiful precisely because they remain unanswered. Did ancient navigators feel afraid crossing thousands of miles of open water? Probably. Did they also feel wonder? I imagine they did, every single day. Those emotions have never really been enemies. Wonder has always carried a little fear with it. That's what makes it wonder. As I stood on the beach watching the stars appear over the Pacific Ocean, I realized I wasn't thinking about ghosts. I wasn't thinking about paranormal investigations. I wasn't thinking or trying to explain folklore or to prove anything. I was simply standing beside something unimaginably old, listening to waves that had reached the shore millions of times before I arrived and would continue long after I was gone. For a brief moment, every deadline, every notification, every argument on the internet, every worry waiting back on the mainland felt wonderfully insignificant. Not because my life didn't matter, because perspective had quietly returned. Maybe that's the real gift of the islands. It's not escape, it's scale. You know, I think every place has a question waiting for us, not an answer. A question. The desert asks whether silence can become a companion. The mountains ask how small we're willing to feel. Old forests ask how much of the world existed before our names were ever spoken. And Hawaii asks whether we know the difference between visiting and belonging. I've been thinking about that concierge again, the man who arrived on vacation and simply never left. For years, I admired the courage of that decision. Now I find myself wondering something else. What does it mean to truly belong somewhere? Can enough time pass that a place slowly adopts you? Or is belonging something earned through respect rather than residency? I still don't know. And maybe that's exactly why the question stays with me. Traveling has a funny way of exposing our assumptions. We arrive believing we'll discover a place. Most of the time, we end up discovering ourselves instead. I think that's why Hawaii lingers in people's memories long after the flight home. It isn't just beautiful, because beauty exists everywhere. It's perspective. For a few days, the ocean decides your schedule. Rain arrives without asking. Clouds drift across mountains that are older than every building you've ever entered. Volcanoes quietly remind you that the ground itself is still being written. Everything feels wonderfully unfinished. Maybe that's why so many stories survive here. Not because the islands are somehow more magical than everywhere else. Because people who live alongside them tend to develop immense respect for them. That's very different than fear. Because respect says, I don't control this. Modern life rarely gives us opportunities to practice that sentence. We control thermostats, navigation, music, lights, groceries arrive at our front doors. Information appears before we've finished asking the question. Control has become so ordinary that we mistake it for permanence. Then we stand beside the Pacific Ocean, and every illusion quietly washes away. The tide doesn't care about reservations. The wind doesn't care about our calendars. The waves don't recognize property lines. The islands themselves exist because deep beneath the surface, forces beyond our comprehension continue shaping the earth, one eruption at a time. There's something deeply comforting about realizing the universe has absolutely no interest in performing for us. It simply is. Maybe that's why I struggled with the word peaceful. The Pacific Ocean isn't peaceful. It's patient. It's watched navigators follow stars across impossible distances. It's carried fishermen before sunrise. It's welcomed children learning to swim. It's swallowed ships. It's returned driftwood polished by years of motion. It's watched kingdoms rise. It's watched governments arrive. It's watched cultures adapt, endure, and remember. Whether an ocean can literally remember is a question for philosophers and poets. I'm content leaving it there. But I do think places collect meaning. Walk into an old family home after decades away. Visit a school hallway from childhood. Return to a street where someone once waited for you. The buildings haven't changed, yet something inside immediately responds. Memory isn't always stored in people. Sometimes it's stored in relationship. Maybe that's what folklore really accomplishes. Not proving that ghosts exist. Preserving relationships. Relationships with ancestors, with mountains, with forests, with oceans. With the idea that the land deserves something from we as humanity besides consumption. Respecting a place is different than consuming it. I've carried that thought ever since I returned from Hawaii. It changes the way I travel. It changes the way I listen. It even changes the way I tell stories, because every legend we explore this week belongs to people who call these islands home. We are visitors, guests, observers. The best guests leave a place with gratitude instead of ownership. As our flight eventually climbed away from Kona, the islands grew smaller until they became dark shapes surrounded by endless blue. Then even those disappeared. Once again, there was nothing but sky and Pacific in every direction. Hours later, the mainland would reappear. Traffic would return, notifications would return, schedules would return, ordinary life would quietly reclaim its place. But something else returned with me too. Perspective. Whenever life feels unbearably complicated, I find myself remembering waves arriving at the same shoreline they have visited for thousands of years. No urgency, no performance, no need to convince anyone of anything. Just steady movement, patient movement. Maybe that's why the Pacific feels spiritual to me. Not because I expect answers, because it gently reminds me that certainty was never the point. Wonder was.